In 1989, Nintendo owned the video game industry. Not owned it the way successful companies own markets, owned it the way empires own territory. Their console was in 30% of American homes. Their characters were on lunchboxes and Saturday morning cartoons. Their approval or disapproval could make or break a game developer overnight. Nobody had beaten Nintendo. Nobody had even seriously tried. And then a Japanese company called Sega looked at Nintendo's stronghold on the market and decided to do something that the entire industry thought was either brilliant or absolutely insane. They decided to go after Nintendo's customers directly, personally, by name. To understand what Sega did, you have to understand what Nintendo had built. Nintendo had effectively saved the American video game industry. After the catastrophic market crash of 1983, when Atari and a flood of terrible games caused consumers to abandon the industry entirely, Nintendo arrived with the NES in 1985 and convinced a skeptical market that video games were worth trying again. They did it by being extremely careful. Quality control was rigorous. Only games Nintendo approved could be published for the NES. Every cartridge carried the official Nintendo seal of quality. The brand stood for something specific: fun, family friendly, and trustworthy. Mario became the most recognizable video game character in the world. And from a marketing standpoint, what Nintendo built was almost perfect. They had brand identity, they had quality control, they had consumer trust, and they had a character, Mario, who was genuinely beloved. That's a moat. That's the kind of competitive position that usually takes decades to build. Zelda invented a genre. Nintendo wasn't just winning, it was defining what a video game was supposed to be. But every empire has a blind spot. And Nintendo's blind spot was its customers. Nintendo marketed to families, to children, to parents buying Christmas gifts. That was a deliberate and enormously successful strategy, but it meant the kids who were getting older, the teenagers who thought Mario was just too cute, too safe, too young for them, were starting to feel like Nintendo wasn't talking to them anymore. And Sega noticed. And Sega had a plan. Sega was not a new company. They had been trying to compete with Nintendo for years. Their Sega Master System had gone up against the NES and lost. Badly. Nintendo had cornered most of the major third-party developers with exclusive licensing deals, leaving Sega with a thinner game library and far less shelf space. When Sega launched the Genesis in North America in August of 1989, the conventional wisdom was that this would be another failed attempt by a company that couldn't beat Nintendo. Sega's response to that conventional wisdom was to change the rules of the game entirely. Here's what I love about what Sega did. They looked at the landscape, recognized they couldn't beat Nintendo at Nintendo's own game, family friendly, broad appeal, institutional trust, and instead of trying to outdo Nintendo, they found the audience Nintendo wasn't talking to: teenagers, young adults, people who wanted something edgier, faster, more mature. That's not just a marketing strategy, that's positioning genius. The strategy had two prongs. The first was hardware. Genesis was a 16-bit console at a time when Nintendo was still selling the 8-bit NES. 16 bits versus 8 bits. In an era before most consumers even understood processors, that number had enormous psychological power. The second prong was attitude. Sega made a deliberate decision to position itself as the cool, rebellious alternative to Nintendo's wholesome establishment. Their advertising was loud, fast, and aggressive, the exact opposite of Nintendo's warm family imagery. And in 1990, they launched a campaign that would define the entire war. 4 words, one direct comparison, and a made-up word that somehow became one of the most memorable slogans in advertising history. The campaign was direct comparative advertising, a technique most brands avoid because it legitimizes the competitor by naming them. Sega did the opposite. They named Nintendo constantly in every ad because every mention of Nintendo reminded viewers that Sega was its equal, that this was a real fight between real competitors. This is a risky move. Most brand strategists will tell you not to name your competitor in advertising because you're spending your own money to make people think about them. Sega's bet was that by the time you finish thinking about Nintendo, you'd be thinking about how Sega was better. And for a certain demographic, the teenagers, the young adults, the kids who wanted something Nintendo wasn't giving them, it worked perfectly. By 1991, just 2 years after launch, Sega had clawed its way to a majority share of the American video game console market. A majority against Nintendo. But Sega wasn't done, because what Genesis did to Nintendo was just the opening move. What came next was one of the most audacious marketing bluffs in the history of consumer electronics: blast processing. The Genesis did have certain technical characteristics that could, under specific circumstances, produce faster results for certain types of graphic processing. Whether this constituted a genuine, meaningful performance advantage over the Super NES is something video game historians still debate. What is not debatable is what Sega's marketing did with it. They shouted it constantly in commercials, in magazine ads, in store displays: blast processing, blast processing, blast processing, until the phrase became synonymous with the idea that Genesis was faster, more powerful, and more capable than anything Nintendo was selling. Parents who had no idea what a processor was walked into toy stores asking for the console with blast processing. Children argued about it on playgrounds without being able to define it. It became real, not because it was technically accurate, but because Sega said it loud enough, often enough, and confidently enough that the market accepted it as truth. This is one of the most important marketing lessons in the whole story. Confidence is a form of persuasion. When you say something with total authority and a voice that doesn't allow for doubt, people absorb it as fact. Sega didn't say we believe our console may have certain processing advantages in a specific scenario. They said blast processing like it was a category and they owned it. That's the difference between a feature and a brand. Nintendo, to their credit, would eventually respond, but they were still playing catch up. Mario was not just a video game character. By 1990, Mario was a cultural institution. He had starred in 3 landmark games, appeared in a Saturday morning cartoon, been featured in a theatrical film, and sold merchandise in numbers that rivaled Mickey Mouse. If Sega was going to truly challenge Nintendo, they needed their own Mario. Someone who can go on a box. Someone who could anchor their own commercials. Someone who meant something. So in April 1990, Sega's president made the directive official. The company needed a flagship mascot, someone as iconic as Mickey Mouse, who could compete directly with Nintendo's Plumber. What I find fascinating about the Sonic origin story is how deliberately commercial it was. Mario emerged from Shigeru Miyamoto's creative vision. He was designing gameplay, and the character grew out of the mechanics. Sonic was engineered backwards. Sega needed a marketing weapon, a character specifically designed to embody everything Nintendo wasn't: speed, attitude, cool. And they reverse engineered a character to deliver those qualities. What emerged was Sonic the Hedgehog. A team of 7 people built a character from scratch in roughly 18 months. The design choices were deliberate marketing decisions. Sonic was colored cobalt blue to match Sega's own logo. His shoes were inspired by Michael Jackson's boots on the Bad album cover. His personality was based on what the team described as the can-do attitude of then Arkansas Governor Bill Clinton. Speed was designed into every pixel of his movement because speed was the one thing Mario, who moved carefully through the precise platforming, couldn't offer. When Sonic launched in June 1991, Bundled with the Genesis in many markets, it sold over 15 million copies worldwide and propelled Sega to a 65% share of the European market that year alone. Think about what Sonic represented as a marketing asset. He wasn't just a character in a game, he was a brand promised, fast, cool, irreverent, and just slightly too edgy for the kids' table. Every time a kid chose Sonic over Mario, they were making a statement about who they were. Sega turned a console purchase into an identity choice. That's the most powerful thing a brand can do. Nintendo noticed, and Nintendo was about to respond. August 1991, Nintendo launched the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in North America. The SNES was, by most objective technical measures, a more sophisticated machine than the Genesis. Superior graphics capabilities, better sound, a controller with more buttons, and a launch library anchored by Super Mario World, one of the best reviewed games ever made. Nintendo's initial response to Sega's aggression had been controlled and deliberate. They had the better hardware, they had the better library, they would let the quality speak for itself. This is a classic established brand mistake. When a scrappy competitor comes after you with attitude and aggression, the instinct is to stay above it, to maintain your dignity, trust your reputation, and let your market sort it out. It works sometimes, but Sega had already changed the terms of the conversation. Nintendo wasn't just competing on quality anymore. They were competing on identity, and quality is a harder brand position than attitude. The Mortal Kombat moment crystallized this perfectly. In 1993, when the massively popular arcade fighting game Mortal Kombat came to the home consoles, Sega allowed the full version, blood, fatalities, and all, while Nintendo required a sanitized version with sweat instead of blood and neutered finishing moves. The Genesis version outsold the SNES version by a factor of 3 to 5. It was a single moment that made the brand positioning argument more clearly than any campaign ever could. Nintendo was for kids, Sega was for everyone else. Nintendo eventually course corrected. They launched the Play It Loud campaign, louder music, edgier visuals, and deliberate attempt to borrow some of Sega's attitude. And the SNES library continued to grow in quality with landmark titles like Donkey Kong Country and Super Metroid. By the mid 90s, the two consoles were in something closer to a genuine battle. But then Sega did something nobody ever expected. They threw it all away. The Sega CD and the 32X are two of the most instructive case studies in brand destruction I've ever encountered. And what makes them so instructive is that neither one was obviously a bad idea on paper. CD-ROM technology was real. A 32-bit upgrade path made technical sense. What Sega missed was something more fundamental: brand coherence. What did Sega stand for? Speed, attitude, and being better than Nintendo. How did a confusing array of expensive add ons that required their existing console communicate any of those things? By 1993, Sega was winning. They had momentum. They had Sonic. They had a generation of teenagers who had chosen Sega as their identity. And then, in the space of about 2 years, they made a serious decision that would systematically dismantle everything they had built. It started with the add ons. The Sega CD, a CD ROM add on for the Genesis, launched in 1992, was expensive, had a limited library, and confused consumers who weren't sure whether they needed it or what it actually offered. It sold just over 2 million units. The 32X, launched in November 1994 as a 32-bit upgrade that attached to the Genesis, was even more damaging. It cost $159, required both the Genesis and the 32X to function, and launched just 6 months after the Sega's actual next generation console. Consumers who bought it were essentially paying to own a product that Sega themselves were about to make obsolete. And then came the Saturn. And the moment that, more than anything else, ended Sega's run as a viable force in the console market. May 11th, 1995. The first ever Electronic Entertainment Expo, E3, in Los Angeles. Sega of America's CEO took the stage to announce the Sega Saturn. The announcement had two parts. The first was the price, $339. The second was a surprise. The Saturn was not launching in September as planned. It was launching right now, like that day, at four select retailers. Put yourself in the room for a second. You're a retailer who has been planning your Saturn display for months. You've allocated shelf space, trained staff, prepared marketing materials for the September launch. And you are finding out, like right now, at E3 from a stage that the console has been available since this morning at your competitor's store. Not yours, theirs. Best Buy, Walmart, and KB Toys were not among the retailers selected for the surprise launch. KB Toys was so offended by the move that they refused to carry Sega products ever again. The launch had only 6 games available. Most third party developers were still preparing for the September date and weren't ready. The console that was supposed to kick off Sega's next generation arrived at retail with almost nothing to play on it. And then Sony walked out. Later that same day at E3, a Sony executive approached the PlayStation podium. He said just 2 words and sat back down. The Saturn was $339. The PlayStation was $299. $100 difference announced at the same event on the same day. Tom Kalinske later said that Sega was certain Sony would price the PlayStation at $399. They built their entire pricing strategy around that assumption. And Sony, deliberately, knowing Sega had already committed publicly to $399, priced it at $299 instead. It was a mic drop before mic drops even existed. And Kalinsky's own words say it all. We were like, we're screwed here. Sony allocated £20 million to the PlayStation marketing in the UK alone for the 1995 holiday season. Sega spent $4 million. By November, PlayStation was outselling Saturn 3-1 in the United Kingdom. Sega tried to course correct. They cut the Saturn's price to $299 in October 1995. They invested in exclusive games. They kept trying. But the moment had passed. The retailers they had alienated were now prioritizing PlayStation. The consumers who had waited for September found a console that was already behind. By the time the Sega Dreamcast arrived in 1999, the damage was already done. In 2001, Sega announced it was exiting the hardware business entirely. The company that had briefly held a majority of the American video game market was out of the console business forever. The Sega vs. Nintendo story is often told as a story about technology, about who had the best hardware, the best specs, the best library. But that misses what actually happened. Sega's rise was a marketing story. They won their share of the market not because the Genesis was objectively superior to the NES, it was the different generations of hardware competing against a previous one. They won because they found an audience that nobody was talking to, built a brand that audiences could claim as their own, and said the word Nintendo more confidently than Nintendo said it themselves. The thing I come back to every time I think about this story is the coherence of Sega's early strategy versus the chaos of their later decisions. When Sega was winning, they knew exactly who they were: edgy, fast, for teenagers, anti Nintendo. Every product, every ad, every mascot expressed the same identity. When Sega started losing, it was because they stopped knowing who they were. The Sega CD, the 32X, the Saturn's disastrous launch, none of those decisions expressed a coherent brand identity. They were just hardware decisions made in a panic. Sega's fall was also a marketing story. They fragmented their brand with add ons that confused consumers. They made a hardware launch decision driven by competitive fear rather than strategic clarity. They assumed Sony would price the PlayStation at the same level they had and didn't have a contingency when Sony did not. And while all that was happening, they forgot the most important thing they had figured out about marketing: clarity. What Genesis did to Nintendo was four words. It said everything. It told you who Sega was, who Nintendo was, and why it mattered in one sentence. By 1995, Sega couldn't say anything that clearly, and brands that could be said clearly can't be bought clearly. Nintendo, meanwhile, did something that doesn't get enough credit. They survived. They didn't win the 16-bit era outright, it was genuinely close. They made mistakes. The Play It Loud campaign was a little desperate, but they never lost their core brand identity: family friendly, quality, trustworthy, Mario. And that identity is still intact even today. Nintendo is still making consoles, Sega is making software. The brand that knew who it was survived. The Nintendo vs. Sega console war reshaped an entire industry. It introduced comparative advertising to consumer electronics. It proved that a challenger brand could take on an entire empire not by being better, but by being different, louder, and more specific about who it was for. And it proved with equal clarity that the moment you forget who you are, the moment your strategy becomes reactive rather than coherent, even the most dominant position in a market can unravel with terrifying speed. There's a generation of people who remember exactly which side they were on. The argument over Sega versus Nintendo wasn't really about processors or pixels, it was about who they were. Whether you were a Nintendo kid or a Sega kid said something about your age, your taste, how you saw yourself. That's what great marketing does. It turns a product into an identity. And for one extraordinary window of time, roughly between 1991 to 1994, Sega did that better than almost anyone in the history of consumer electronics. Down one of the greatest marketing wars ever fought in one of the most unlikely industries imaginable. If you found this interesting, share it. This is exactly the kind of story I want to keep telling on this channel: corporate strategy, brand psychology, and the moments when a decision in the boardroom changed what an entire generation believed about themselves. I'm Nicole. This is the Nicole Breakdown, and I'll see you in the next one.